Thank you. So today I'm going to talk a bit about collecting. Then I'll consider three areas where we might disagree on whether or not we're looking after our books. The first is writing in books. Second is shelving by colour. And the third is the pests that pose most threat to them. But first, briefly, a note about why I wrote this book and what it covers. So there are certain questions that we get asked all the time here in the library by people who own books about where and how best to keep them, whether they might be valuable, what to do with damaged books, and what to do with books that are no longer needed. My book seeks to answer many of these questions by setting some historical examples of how things were done alongside current best practice in institutional libraries, and doing this in a way that you can apply to whatever books you might have at home. I cover the various stages of ownership, from acquiring books to getting rid of them, and many things in between. My first chapter is about collecting, so I thought I would start with a few general words about the sort of collecting that I had in mind when I was writing this book. I think the term book collector comes with quite a lot of baggage that might suit some people, but might put others off. When Stephen Miller wrote a guide to collecting for the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America in 1994, he says that you can't be a collector if you haven't understood the history of books and what they are. This suggests a need to be initiated into a mystery, an exclusive world linked perhaps with other ideas of country houses and wealth. In his essay from 1996, Book Collecting as One of the Fine Arts, Colin Franklin acknowledges that high-end collections of perfect copies and monuments of printing and well-known first editions are now only possible for a tiny few, and that, I quote, "We need to find other ways of delighting in books." And that is the sort of approach I had in mind when writing. Many of us, who wouldn't necessarily call ourselves book collectors, nonetheless have an interesting collection of books at home, including many kinds of books that wouldn't have made it into a grand library or a more traditional collection. A sort of serendipitous grouping, perhaps, that means something to us and has one or more stories to tell. Robert A. Wilson, in his publication of 1980, Modern Book Collecting, notes that most collectors do not begin to collect deliberately. And that was the case for this collection that was a recent donation to the Bodleian Library. What started as a single chance purchase of a book with beautiful illustrations, a copy of Christina Rossetti's poems, published in a deluxe edition by Blackie in 1910, became a quest to put together all the published works of the illustrator and writer Florence Susan Harrison, whose dates were 1877 to 1955. Harrison's identity had long been confused with that of another artist of a similar name, Emma Florence Harrison. And it was only in putting this collection together that the collector, Mary Jacobs, realized that Florence Harrison's identity had been completely obscured and was able to set it straight. She uncovered the real Florence Harrison, writer, artist, and illustrator, and put together as complete a collection of her published work as she could, as well as the biographical and documentary evidence to untangle her from the earlier artist with a similar name. Perhaps the crowning glories of Harrison's work are her deluxe Blackie gift books, Rossetti's poems, Tennyson's Guinevere, and early poems of William Morris, all illustrated with colour plates and line drawings, and with ornamental headpieces, tailpieces, and initials, all by Harrison. But most of the books in the collection are not of this sort, as you saw on the previous slide, being neither rare nor especially valuable. There are lots of Blackie's children's annuals and educational readers for children, often intended as school prizes. But I think this is a really wonderful example of mostly everyday books that, through the gathering of them into a collection, becomes both a fantastic research tool and a physical record of the achievements and identity of an artist who should stand with the great names of Golden Age book illustrators. In his Universal Book of Hobbies and Handicrafts, first published in 1936, Sid Hedges says, "The collecting of books should be everybody's hobby. If you're fond of books, it is inevitable that you shall want to possess them for yourself." I think this is a nice way to think about our relationship with books, whether or not we consider ourselves collectors. And just out of interest at this point, can I take a very quick poll and ask you to raise your hand if you would consider yourself to be a book collector? Okay, for those online, we maybe had half of the hands going up. Is there a line between collecting and simply buying books because you like them? And if so, where might we draw it? You might say that a collector is seeking particular things, but equally, I think we can collect without having an overall purpose. Now, Hedges goes on to suggest a rather amusing way of setting up a library. I quote, "You must try to get a lot of books, for they will help to make the indispensable bookish atmosphere in which your library will most readily develop. Only when you have a bulk on your wall of several hundreds need you begin to discriminate a little more in your purchases. When once you've acquired your massive volumes, you may gradually jettison those whose only merit is bulk until you've come to have just those that are really significant to you." Now, this is probably not a model many of us would want to follow, but there are all sorts of ways of collecting, including on a budget, and I thought I'd share one of mine with you. I collect books that remind me of other books. For example, I like bindings very much, especially 16th century ones. Tudor monarchs were particularly keen on velvet bindings. The book on the left is a large Bible. It's one of the treasures of our printed book collections here in the Bodleian and was presented by the printer Christopher Barker to Elizabeth I as a New Year's gift in 1584. Silver thread and seed pearls adorn the red velvet covering. I rather like velvet too, though I don't have the means to purchase Elizabethan examples. But I happened to spot this little book here on the right at a market stall. It's a little Life of Christ in German, printed in Regensburg in 1847. It's bound in velvet with silver thread, and it reminded me of the library's Elizabeth Bible. And I've shown you the lower board here as the colour of the velvet is brighter. I think it must have been set out on a table for some time, and the upper but not the lower cover has noticeably faded. And these are also not to scale. The Bible is probably at least 16 times bigger than my little book, so I don't want to deceive you. It has an inscription of an unknown owner, no royal connections as far as I can see, and it misses out, of course, on being a Tudor book by quite some time. But for only £10, I was able to have my own velvet binding with silver thread that will always remind me of the great Elizabeth Bible. I have other books in this category too. I also like limp bindings from the 16th century. Again, as I can't afford these, I buy instead limp vellum bindings made for the tourist market in Italy in the early 20th century, such as this one here. This is a 1903 edition of Dante's Vita Nuova with an English presentation inscription, written in 1905 in Florence. And a final example in this category of books that remind me of other books is one that works the other way around and perhaps prompted my later interests. I enjoy working on fragments of medieval manuscripts that were used in the bindings of books. Here's one I worked on a few years ago that turned out to be from an unknown manuscript of a text by the great writer of the 14th and 15th century, Christine de Pizan. I was amused to be reminded that as a child I'd purchased this volume, an edition of Milton's poetical works printed in London in 1851. The spine has come off and that's what's below the book there on the slide. I bought it mostly because of the fragment hidden in its binding. It's not a medieval one, of course, but a bill for hats from the 19th century. It utterly fascinated me as a child that pieces of lives could be hidden away as rubbish in a binding. And I'm sure the memory of this was lurking when I started paying attention much later to scraps of medieval manuscript waste in the bindings of printed books. I've mentioned these examples to suggest just one of so many ways of seeking out books that please us and that group together in odd ways when our wallet doesn't match our aspiration. Now I come to the first of my perhaps controversial claims. I think you should write in your books. Speaking as an employee of the Bodleian, I must ask you not to write in any library books. And as a book owner, I would say, please don't write in anything you borrow from a friend. But as a rare books librarian, I would say, write in your books. This goes specifically against the advice generally given in guides to collecting books. In these, clean copies, that is, without owners' names or marginalia, are prized above used copies. So if we go back to Robert A. Wilson, whom we heard from earlier, he says, the ideal is a book as fresh and bright and perfect in every respect as it was on the day it was issued. This suggests that all books are perfect in every way when they're issued and that a book can't get better as time goes on. I disagree with both of these. New books are often flawed, and that can be part of what makes them interesting. And books can get better with time. We'll come back to this in a minute. The reasons given for not writing in books include, of course, aesthetics, but also value. And both of these concerns have been voiced for a long time. In 1345, Richard de Bury, Chancellor and Treasurer to Edward III, had the following to say in his book, Philobiblon. Impudent boys are to be specially restrained from meddling with books. Wherever they perceive the broadest margin about the text, they furnish it with a monstrous alphabet, or their unchastened pen immediately presume to draw any other frivolous thing whatsoever that occurs to their imagination. They're the Latinist, they're the sophist, they're every sort of unlearned scribe tries the goodness of their pen, which we've frequently seen to have been both injurious to the fairest volumes, both as to utility and price. It is noticeable that he specifically mentions utility and price here. Thomas Bodley also preferred clean copies and had his librarian Thomas James swap out books from the Bodleian that had marginal notes in them for copies without marks. There's an example at Christchurch of just such a book. It used to be in the Bodleian and has 2 words written on a lower end paper, but that seems to have been enough for it to be let go in favour of a clean copy that took its place at the very same shelf mark. And there was a fashion in the 18th and early 19th centuries to cleanse books of all their signs of previous owners. Notes in the margins and ownership marks on title pages and end papers were washed or bleached, worn away with abrasive, or even cut out. This is perhaps the epitome of the desire for a clean copy. This item was in the news a couple of months ago, you might have seen it. It's the first number in the run of the Superman comics. Collectible comics are graded on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being given to comics with, quote, no evidence of any manufacturing or handling defects. Send them off to a specialist company who grade and certify them for you. This Superman was given a grade 9, apparently the highest ever given, and it sold for $9.12 million. But as you can perhaps see, in the process of grading, the comic is sealed in plastic, never again to be opened. It stops being a text and becomes an object that can't be read. This kind of extreme collecting, the desire for the pristine that remains sealed off, seems to me to deny the very nature of what a book is, something to be handled, read, and used. And just as a side example, this is another embroidered binding here in the Bodleian. Although done for practical reasons rather than monetary ones, the result is the same, a book that can't be read. According to the description of it in a sale catalogue in 1832, the binding is said to include a piece of the waistcoat of Charles I. Embroidered bindings are, of course, extremely delicate, and encasing this one in perspex that readers cannot open is a way of allowing it to be safely handled. But only as a binding, not as a book. The text is completely inaccessible. While it is true that we do have another copy of this edition in the library, so the text is available to readers, we can't be sure now whether this copy has textual variants or interesting marks of ownership in it. Books do and should change over time. It's a good thing. If you were to follow Wilson's advice for book collectors, you would select clean and pristine copies and follow Thomas Bodley in preferring copies without notes. But suppose I were to offer you a choice between two copies of one of the great monuments of book collecting, Shakespeare's First Folio. And for those who are less familiar with it, it was the first collected edition of Shakespeare's works, with 18 of his plays printed for the first time, including Julius Caesar and Macbeth. It's not a rare book, with some 235 copies currently known, but they generally sell for a few million. So your choice is between one copy in pristine condition without any annotations and one with copious notes, such as this one here, and there's a close-up of some of the notes. We saw the title page, and the annotations are just those of an anonymous reader. At least they were until 2019, when they were identified by Jason Scott Warren at Cambridge as those of John Milton. Wouldn't we all rather have this one than a clean copy? Thank goodness this book did not suffer the fate of so many books in the 18th and 19th centuries that had their marginalia removed. Similarly, we would be all the poorer if this book had had its annotations removed or the copy discarded because of them. And this is probably my favourite book in the library. It's The Institution of a Christian Man, printed in 1537, also known as the Bishop's Book, setting out how Henry VIII's new religion was to be administered. This copy has a note on both paste downs saying, "The King's commandment is that I shall not be had out of the privy chamber," and the note is in Henry VIII's hand. In fact, the whole book is annotated, not just in Henry's hand, but also in that of Thomas Cranmer. And this is the best bit. Here's a page that sets out the 10 Commandments, and you can see Henry annotating here. Here's a close-up of the 10th. "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's wife," and Henry has added the words "wrongly or unjustly." Interesting take on it all. Happily, the book did escape the Privy Chamber. It was not discarded for its annotations, and it found its way to the Bodleian in the 18th century as one of the many annotated books in the collection of Richard Rawlinson. We can also be glad that the person who rebound this edition of Fanny Burney's Camilla was not even more ruthless in trimming the edges of this book. There's a faint pencil note at the bottom of the page that has been partly trimmed away. It's about the character Mr. Marchmont, and it's in Jane Austen's hand. Now, I'm not suggesting that all annotations will turn out to be by someone significant, or that they need to be by anyone of note to be of interest. Here's an edition of Virgil from 1512, very densely annotated, but the annotator not identified. We have so many examples of these school texts being used in this way. And even if we don't ever work out anything about the people annotating them, they show students working on the same texts that we work on 500 years, them doing it 500 years ago. This is a page from that same Virgil. And in this particular edition, as I hope you can see, it's been printed with the intention that readers write in it. Look at the wide spacing between the lines of text, specifically allowing for notes. The examples I've given so far are all annotations relating to the printed text. Margins record other unrelated information, often personal, such as family births, deaths, and marriages, but also contemporary events. For example, this note appears in the first edition of the Complete Bible in Danish, printed in Copenhagen in 1550. The note records with a sketch the Great Comet of 1577 and that it was visible on St. Martin's Day. The book also has a wonderful presentation inscription in it from 1602, and I'll show you just because we're on this book, in which the donor giving it to the university thanks the Oxford academic community for treating foreigners with kindness. And even when the notes themselves are the marks that Richard de Bury was indignant about in the quote I gave above, the pen trials, the alphabets, etc., and might seem unimportant, when a mass of data of this sort is assembled, it can offer insights and patterns in ownership, use, and the circulation of books. And this is where a great deal of scholarship in book history is now focused, on all marks, whether anonymous or not, so that by recording these in library catalogues or databases in large numbers, scholars can start to ask and answer interesting questions. And a model for this kind of activity is a scholarly project many of you will know, Material Evidence in Incunabula. The database records all marks of use in books printed in the 15th century, giving them a geographical location and a date as far as possible, offering a wealth of evidence and patterns of book use across time and place. And this is why I think we should all write in our books. Whoever we are, we have to supply future generations with material for research and not leave a void in the historical record. How owners recorded their names in books is also of interest. For example, the sort of information they choose to present. And this is something we might consider when writing our name in a book. Obvious things include name and date, but also place of purchase and price. Some people mention their qualifications, and others, more interestingly, their profession. While lawyers and clergy do this frequently, I've come across two goldsmiths who seem proud to mention their job when inscribing a book. Here's one of those, in a book on coinage. The inscription translates as, "This book belongs to Arnold Whelan, goldsmith, dwelling by the butchers in Liège." There was a man of this name appointed director of the Mint in Liège in 1744, who is almost certainly this man. Some also state their ownership in verses or a phrase, such as this one, written by a girl in Italy in the 18th century. And this one translates roughly as, "This book is of paper, this paper is of rag, this rag is of linen, this linen is of earth, this earth is of God, and this book is mine, Teresa Ingenui." The more you include in your own inscriptions, the more you will delight future scholars and librarians. Another very good reason to write your name in your books is to guard against theft. And this is, of course, why libraries stamp their books. Or if you're considering lending them. Francis Dowse, whose large collection came to the Bodleian in 1834, kept a notebook on books lent. And I'm very grateful to my colleague Alan Coates for pointing this one out to me. It sets out the hazards of lending. Dowse laments, there are in reality very few persons to whom books or prints should be lent. And I have met with such unaccountable and unexpected treatment, even from those whom I should have supposed the very last persons to be guilty of it, that I have almost made a resolution to lend no more books, except to such as have always punctually returned them. He lists his loans with names and length of time and the notes on their fates. Some books never came back. I quote, H.L. Rose borrowed a unique fragment of Parthenope, and after keeping it more than a year, he modestly told me he had mislaid it, and I suppose I shall never see it again. And some things came back damaged. I lent Dibdin a valuable print by the master of 1466, which was returned with holes drilled through it by his engraver to get an outline. Dowse didn't write his name in all of his books. Perhaps more might have been returned if he did. And it's no wonder then that so many books carried curses. Here's an example of one, Anathema Alferenti, it says. And you can read all about these in Eleanor Baker's book, Book Curses, that came out in 2024 with Bodleian Library Publishing. So while I have merrily encouraged you to write in your books, you might still exercise caution. I felt slightly anxious when someone quoted me on Instagram alongside a picture of a book they'd annotated in highlighter. If you are writing in a book that is of historical import, maybe use a pencil for your annotations, and not least in case you change your mind about what you've written. And I have this volume as a gentle warning. This is a book my husband annotated in his first year as an undergraduate here at Oxford. Coming back to it at a later point, he was so embarrassed by his annotations that he cut them all out. So I'll now move on to my second topic. There are lots of pictures on social media of people arranging their books by colour. And I've witnessed friendly debates about whether this is in any way sensible. These are shelves belonging to the actor and lifestyle brand owner Gwyneth Paltrow. And these are the shelves of tidying guru Marie Kondo, who I fear would have you throw out all your books. But I'll come back to these in a minute. We do have a strong memory for colour, and readers here in the library ask surprisingly often for a book by a half-remembered title and the colour of its binding. Accidental arrangement by colour is all around us in library collections, where runs of particular publications, of course, identify and group themselves by colour. So what are the arguments in favour and against using colour as a way of shelving books? There's a book called The Fundamentals of Library Classification, published in 1951, that continues to come out in new editions to this day. Its author, Bernard I. Palmer, gives serious consideration to arrangement by colour because of our good memory for it, though he ultimately dismisses it on two grounds. First, as an ephemeral feature that tells us nothing about the book, and second, for the practical reason that only a limited spectrum of colours is used for book covers, and individual colour groupings would have too many books in them to make finding something easy. Who, he suggests, has a big enough run of turquoise books or a small enough run of navy ones for this to be useful. And all is, of course, not quite as it seems. When we look more closely, Marie Kondo has already arranged her books by subject. Those were all cookbooks in that slide. And Gwyneth Paltrow has commissioned wrappers for her books so that she can colour code them by subject. Have the money to rebind or place your books in colour-coded wrappers and have unlimited space, then that is perfectly sensible. Anthony Hobson, a historian of Renaissance book bindings, did something similar with his reference books on historic bindings. He had them rebound so as to be colour-coded by geographical subject area. All his books on French bindings are grouped together in one colour and so on. There's an idea that goes quite far back too. I just want to give a couple of examples from the 16th and 17th centuries. Take, for instance, so-called travelling libraries. These were groups of small format books, uniformly bound, set out on shelves in a box that could be carried. They seem to have their origins in the late 16th century. This is the earliest one that we know of, put together by the Venetian ambassador to France, Pietro Duodo, in the 1590s. He had a travelling library made for him in Paris, bound in 3 different colours to reflect their subject matter: red for theology, philosophy and history, yellowish olive for medicine, and botany, and brown for literature. These are 3 of the surviving volumes. I'm afraid the colour differences don't show up that easily on the slide, but they do represent those 3 colours. And here is one of several travelling libraries from the early 17th century. This one still has its book-shaped box. And although the bindings look the same, the books have silk ties in 3 different colours to match the subject matter of each shelf. Blue ties for theology and philosophy, red for history, and green, as you can see on the one that's taken off and laid out at the front, for poetry. So the colour coding of books is in fact quite an old idea, made at the point of binding. If, like me, you're not adding new bindings to your modern books, or commissioning wrappers for them, but keeping them as the publisher created them, colour is not the most practical arrangement. Aside from whether or not you can find anything, they will take up more space, as you'll have large and small books of the same colour shelved together, rather than all your small books together of whatever colour. But I do know people who do this just because the look of it pleases them, and if that works for you, then why not? So, writing in books and shelving by colour are 2 things some of us might disagree on. Another is pests. Which pests pose the greatest threat to your books? I'm going to offer you multiple choice. A, rodents. B, so-called bookworm. C, birds. D, humans. Let's consider each in turn and what you can do about them. Rodents pose an obvious threat to books and items on paper. I had a shoebox of letters that was shredded by mice, but I'm in good company. Here's one of the Bodleian's 4 issues of Magna Carta, this one from 1217, sent by the Royal Chancery to Oxford, and it owes the Abbey until its dissolution in 1539. At some point in its history, stored folded up, rodents nibbled a hole in it, making 3 holes when unfolded. There's not a great deal you can do to prevent this, other than keeping an eye on books stored in quiet corners. The worm is perhaps more of a common problem. Richard de Bury notes the volumes he saw in England's monasteries in the 14th century as pierced through with the gnawing of worms. These are holes made by the larvae of wood-boring insects, most probably furniture beetle, often referred to as bookworm. These insects are interested in wooden shelves, but will happily make their way into books on wooden shelves and lay their eggs in them. The larvae from these then hatch outside the book and leave holes as they munch their way out, often taking several years. If you find any holes in your books, and the damage looks recent, there might be some frass or even a live creature, you can take simple measures. Seal the book in a plastic bag and freeze it for 2 weeks. The Palace of Mafra in Portugal uses bats as a natural pest control. They encourage them to roost behind the bookcases, and then they cover the cases with cloths every night and let the bats come out to hunt. I wouldn't recommend this for your library at home. Now for our third villain, birds. You probably weren't expecting this one. Neither was I, and I didn't include it among the pests listed in my book. Here's the damage in question. And here are the culprits. And now that I know the damage they can cause, I find myself looking suspiciously at the many birds we see with books of art. Is the one here contemplating a tasty snack, I wonder? Our fourth villain, humans. This might look like further worm damage. It's not. This is a box set that was kept too close to a dartboard. We humans and the way we handle our books are perhaps the pest causing the most damage. And the kind of things we should think about with our own books at home are the same as the ones we consider in a special collections library. This is the poster that we display in our reading rooms here in the Western. A lot of it is common sense, of course. It echoes what Richard de Bury said 700 years ago, so I'll be quoting him quite a bit in what follows. The first thing for safe handling of books, listed first here on the poster, is having clean, dry hands. As Richard de Bury says, washing should without fail precede reading. He mentions a careless youth. Says he will apply his wet hands, oozing with sweat, to turning over the volumes, or using dusty gloves of dirty leather to hunt over the page line by line, while these hazards are easily avoided. The second is eating and drinking. We, of course, don't allow food or drink in our special collections reading rooms, though some drinks are now allowed in other Bodleian reading rooms. Again, Richard de Bury laments that same careless youth who, I quote, is not ashamed to eat fruit and cheese over an open book and to transfer his empty cup from side to side upon it. This is given a 1980s twist by Robert A. Wilson, who says, never ever, under any circumstances, allow anyone to handle any of your books while holding a pipe, cigar, cigarette, or drink. Richard de Bury suggests keeping elbows off open books. And whether open or closed, there are some other things that shouldn't go on books. For example, babies. And here's another slide of more babies on books. And they certainly shouldn't stand on them. And while we're on the subject of babies, is this one a careful handler of a very fine book, or is that ribbon in his hand about to meet its end? Books are to be opened and closed carefully. Again, in the words of Richard de Bury, let there be a mature decorum in opening and closing of volumes, that they may neither be unclasped with precipitous haste, nor thrown aside after inspection without being duly closed. For it is necessary that a book should be much more carefully preserved than a shoe. I think we'd all agree about that. And we should only open books to an angle that is comfortable for them and support them with a bookrest. This cardinal here with the large book needs one of these, as our reading room also lays out in its rules. And you might consider a foam breast or cushion for any special books that you have at home, and a lead weight to hold the pages down. Finally, you might think about how you move your books around. Probably not on a donkey, although this one is on a stand. But this donkey has the added hazard of a bird. And now that we know not to trust birds with books, we should all beware of that. Two hands are surely needed to carry rather than balance such a fine book as the one being held here. This child, for example, is doing a much better job. So look after your books, and thank you for listening.